If you're into true crime at all, there's a fair chance you've seen this image. Over the past couple of years, this picture has gained infamy on different subreddits and forums for its disturbing appearance. Like many police reconstructions, this image falls square into the uncanny valley. Clearly, this is not a real person, but rather the suggestion of someone who used to be alive. The pained expression on her face makes it worse. Not only does a small touch of personalization make this approximation of an actual woman feel closer to reality, it also immortalizes the end of what must have been a hard life. Indeed, researching this case reveals a particularly horrific mystery. At its center, a vulnerable woman who was likely in pain every day of her life until it was brutally cut short in early 1993. Almost 30 years later, what really happened to this woman whose head was discovered in the bushes of an Illinois state park is still unknown. Before we proceed further, please note that this video contains semi-graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. On the afternoon of January 27, 1993, two girls aged 10 and 12 were walking through a wooded campground in Illinois' Wayne Fitzgerald State Park when they made a horrifying discovery. Tangled among the bushes was a decapitated human head. Police arrived at the scene around 40 minutes later and began their investigation. Immediately, one detail stuck out to them. Though the head was surrounded by vegetation, it was clearly visible to everyone at the scene, meaning that whoever had been responsible for putting it there had made no effort to conceal it. This, coupled with the fact that there was a major road a short distance away, led police to believe that the head had been thrown from a moving vehicle. By 8 p.m., the head was removed and transported to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Mount Vernon, Illinois, for further examination. The following day, a search for the rest of the body began, but unfortunately, no other remains have ever been found. The head was later determined to have belonged to an adult woman. Due to the location where she was found, she was dubbed the Wayne Fitzgerald Doe, or Ena Jane Doe, after the town that lies just north of the state park. Her true identity, however, would remain a mystery for nearly 30 years. No one could be certain how long she had been in the woods. Given that it was still winter, the cold weather had prevented worse decomposition, as well as animal and insect interference. Still, her eyes were fully dehydrated, something that typically occurs 4 to 5 days after death. The fact that she had not been found earlier suggested that she had not been there long, as that area, sometimes referred to as the Primitive Camp Road, was regularly visited. It was thus concluded that she had been there for less than 2 weeks. Further examination revealed that she was most likely white, though she may have had some black or Native American ancestry. Her age was estimated to have been anywhere from her late 20s to 50s. However, reports do admit that attempts to determine age based solely on characteristics of the skull are often frustratingly imprecise. Investigators were likely to find the most important information regarding her identity through her other physical traits. For one, she appeared to have had extensive dental work done, including a rather unique procedure on her lower left molar. This molar, referred to as tooth number 19, had gotten a triple root canal filling and had a porcelain crown. Additionally, all of her wisdom teeth had been removed. This information was sent out to dentists in the area in hopes that one of them might remember having done such a procedure on one of their patients, but unfortunately, it appears that this lead went nowhere. Despite all the previous dental care she had received before, it appeared as though her life circumstances had changed in more recent years. Several of her teeth were in poor condition, with some having rotted all the way down to the gums. Ultimately, the Jane Doe's most distinctive feature was her neck, more specifically, her front cervical vertebrae. She appeared to have suffered from a condition known as spasmodic torticollis, commonly known as Ryeneck syndrome, which causes painful twisting and tilting of the head and neck. In people with this condition, the neck tends to tilt to one side while the chin tilts to the other, putting stress on the muscles responsible for keeping the head upright. Spasmodic torticollis is a relatively rare condition that could happen to anyone at any age, though it is more prevalent in middle-aged people, and in women more often than men. It is a chronic condition, with no cure, that is often painful as well as visually apparent. Her hyoid bone had not been fractured, but there were lacerations to her scalp, as well as evidence of an interstitial hemorrhage. It was concluded that her most likely cause of death was homicide by multiple blows to the head. She was then decapitated by what appears to have been a single stroke, indicating that her killer used a sharp knife and was ostensibly male. But ultimately, this was not enough information to identify the woman, and the case went cold. Luckily, interest in the mystery, thanks in part to online true crime communities, ensured that she was not forgotten. In January of 2022, forensic artist Carl Kopelman released a new reconstruction of her. He notably chose not to emphasize her neck condition, and even did a slight variation where the Jane Doe is wearing eye makeup. Then, in early March, a breakthrough.
Well, good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. A hard copy of this press release is going to be released at a later time after this conference this morning. Thank you specifically State Representative Dave Stevern for joining us today for this important news. And I am pleased to report the investigators of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and specialists of Redgrave Research Forensic Services have confirmed the identity of Ina Jane Doe, an unidentified woman whose remains were discovered 29 years ago in Jefferson County.
So, I was in the middle of writing the script when the news broke that the Jane Doe had finally been identified. Even though I knew that the case was still being investigated and there had been some recent developments within the past year, I can honestly say that I was not expecting it. For me, it was surprising not only that this was finally partially solved, given how little evidence there was for investigators to work with, but also that the majority of the theories surrounding the background of this woman were all pretty off the mark, really. On websites such as Reddit and web sleuths, many people believe that she might have been a disabled person, perhaps one who was abused and ultimately murdered by someone who was supposed to be their caretaker, similar to another solved Doe mystery, Peggy Lynn Johnson. Others believe that she may have been a homeless person, a theory seemingly given credence by her lack of dental care later in life. Some even believe that she may have been shunned or run away from an insular religious community. In reality, things were a bit more strange than that. With help from services such as Asteria Labs and Redgrave Research Forensic Services, authorities were finally able to give the Jane Doe her name back and pinpoint the moment when she had last been seen. Her real name was Susan Lund. She was a 25-year-old mother of 3 children aged 6, 4, and 2. Her daughter, Crystal, recalls her leaving their Clarksville, Tennessee house on Christmas Eve, 1992. She was said to have been headed to the local grocery store, a Winn-Dixie, to purchase a pie for Christmas dinner. Notably, Susan left the house at around 7:30 p.m., well after sundown. Not only would she have been walking in the dark to the grocery store, which was around 4 miles away, but she was also pregnant at the time. Susan never came home, and her husband, Paul Lund, quickly reported her disappearance. Her sister, Pamela Reyes, is believed to have actually been the last person to have spoken to her. According to Pamela, who talked to her on the phone, Susan was doing well. Pamela was quoted saying, "We were making plans to talk, and I was making plans to come down and visit her. It's just like we were celebrating Christmas, and then all this. It's never been the same. We've always had a piece of our family missing." Police initially took her disappearance seriously, and land and air searches were conducted in the Clarksville area, but they were unable to find any trace of her. So now, here's where things get weird. In a Reddit post made to the true crime subreddit by a Redgrave research intern who worked on the case, authorities then received 8 separate phone calls from people claiming to have seen Susan in Clarksville and Nashville, Tennessee. They later received even more phone calls which placed her just under 30 miles away in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, on or around December 30th. Police believe that these sightings were credible and thus scaled back their search as they believe that Susan was alive. This may be partly because, in February 1993, Paul allegedly told police that Susan had been seen earlier at some point, looking pale, thin, and emaciated, as well as wearing the same clothes she was wearing on the night of her disappearance. However, judging from some social media comments made by the couple's children, there appears to be some contention as to whether or not Paul ever actually made this claim or if it was later fabricated by someone else. And finally, there's this. In July of 1993, police received a supposedly credible tip indicating that Susan was living in a trailer park in a small town outside of Birmingham, Alabama. When police got there, they were told by Susan that she was fine and wanted to be left alone. Police never actually made direct contact with her and left the scene, around 80% sure that this woman was Susan. Since it was not a crime for an adult to run away, police refused to look further into this and soon closed the case. Now, I'm sure you've already guessed the obvious problem here. By July 1993, the real Susan had been deceased for months. So who actually was this woman, and why had she been pretending to be Susan? This along with what happened to the real Susan within the month between her vanishing and death, remains unknown. Susan Lund finally got her name back after 29 years, but the second most important piece of this puzzle is still missing. Who was her killer? As soon as the news of her identification became public, countless social media users began to suspect Paul Lund. After all, Susan had been pregnant, which, statistically speaking, is when women are the most likely to be killed by a spouse or partner. The details surrounding her final moments also seem fishy. Why would a pregnant woman make an 8-mile round trip on foot to the grocery store at such an hour? You'd think Paul would have driven her, or at the very least accompany her to where she was going. Now, here's what the couple's children have said about the matter. According to them, the family did not have a car, nor did they have a phone at their house, and they used public payphones whenever they needed to make important calls. Thus, Susan may have wanted to make a phone call at the Winn-Dixie in addition to purchasing items for Christmas dinner. The fact that it was a holiday and relatively late in the evening could indicate that the call was important and, depending on who she may have been calling, Susan may have wanted some privacy, and so she did not ask Paul to come with her. Paul also could have stayed at home to watch their 3 very young children. I must note that the 2 older siblings have said that their father had been with them that evening. Their mother also did not have a life insurance policy, nor do they recall them ever fighting. Of course, other users have pointed out that they were only 6 and 4 years old at the time, and their recollection of events might not be the most reliable. Still, Susan's own children are adamant that their father was not involved in their mother's disappearance. The accusations have upset them greatly, which is understandable considering that Paul Lund actually passed away in February 2020, which was not that long ago. Not only did he pass away without ever finding out what really happened to his wife, he is now being accused of this frankly horrific crime. I cannot imagine how it must feel to lose your only parent, find out that your other long-lost parent was a victim of a brutal murder, and have the parent who was with you your entire life be blamed for it. Whether or not you choose to believe that Paul was involved in what happened to Susan, I think it's safe to say that the remaining family is currently going through some major emotional whiplash, so publicly speculating on their family dynamics on social media pages where they can see is not helpful or necessary at this time. Within the police file, there is a report of some unusual graffiti in the men's restroom of a now-defunct truck stop in Evansville, Illinois. At around 7 p.m. on March 6, 1993, a truck stop employee informed police of a message that read, "Serial killer, March 1993. 19 and counting. 5 men, 12 women, 2 children, 8 black, 8 white, 3 Hispanic. Don't worry, I'll get to the others." The message was written in black felt tip marker and was believed to have been put there within 24 hours of its discovery. While there's a good chance that this was done as some kind of edgy joke, it does bring to mind the possibility that there was a still unknown murderer loose in Illinois in early 1993, which brings me to the next theory, that Susan was the victim of a serial killer. In particular, some users have linked her to the Redhead murders. From 1978 to 1992, there was a series of still unsolved homicides of red-haired women around Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The total number of victims is believed to be anywhere from 6 to 11, several of which either remain unidentified or were unidentified for several years after their bodies were found. The age range of the victims is also very wide, with the youngest possibly having been 9 and the oldest 45 at the time of their deaths. After hair color, the second most prominent characteristic of this killer is that they dumped the bodies alongside major highways. Several of the identified victims were later revealed to have been estranged from their families, lived transient lives, or were otherwise not local to the area where their bodies were discovered. The big problem with this theory is that we still don't know who was behind the Redhead murders, or even if these crimes were really committed by the same individual. And although Susan's murder did meet some of these characteristics, there's also details that don't match up with the other crimes. For one, she was living with her family and was not that far from home when she disappeared. Second is that, while authorities were never able to definitely determine Susan's cause of death, the autopsy results showed that she was likely not strangled and instead suffered from blunt force trauma. None of the other victims were decapitated, and the closest thing to this kind of horrific mutilation is that one of the unidentified possible victims' complete skeletal remains have never been found. Another serial killer I've seen mentioned, though admittedly far less frequently, is Gary Michael Hilton. Hilton is known for having murdered at least 4 people in state parks, and though his confirmed victims were killed in the early 2000s, he has been suspected of other crimes dating back to the 90s. Hilton appears to have operated around Florida and the southern Appalachia region. Illinois is a bit out of the way, but I'm not really sure this would be enough to rule him out as a suspect entirely, so I'd love to know your guys' thoughts on this guy in particular. The idea that Susan was killed by someone she knew or was the victim of a serial killer are just two theories of an untold number of possibilities, and quite honestly, neither really seems satisfactory. There's just so many strange elements to this case and not enough information available to explain any of them, like, where was she for almost an entire month between her disappearance and death? How did she end up almost 200 miles away in Illinois? Did she meet up with someone voluntarily, or was she abducted? What connection, if any, did she have to Alabama, and why would someone pretend to be her? And finally, could there have been yet another serial killer out there who has never been caught? I would love to hear your thoughts on this case because I honestly don't know what to make of it at this point. After almost 30 years, the Ina Jane Doe finally has her name back. But though the most important part of this mystery has been solved, it seems to have left law enforcement, as well as the public, with more questions than answers. For the sake of her remaining family, if her killer ever is identified, I really hope that any resolution they find is the least painful one possible. For now, I'd like to take a moment to revisit this image. Now that we know what the real Susan looked like, I think we're all in agreement that this looked nothing like her. Though many police reconstructions are unsettling, there's just something about this one in particular that makes people upset. Surely, when trying to imitate the features of an unknown person, you would want to make them look as much like the body as you possibly can. But I don't know if Susan's family would have been able to identify her from this reconstruction. So why did they make it look like this? Well, one thing I've often heard is that when a doe has a noticeable feature, forensic artists might try to exaggerate it in the hopes that the reconstruction would stand out to people who knew them when they were alive. Allegedly, this is the story behind the infamous Jenny Gamez image. Though we know now that Susan's torticollis was nowhere near as pronounced as the image makes it seem, it was all law enforcement had to go on in the 90s. So, while I'm glad that Susan eventually got a much more accurate reconstruction, I can't help but feel like this notorious image did its job, in a way. Without it, knowledge about this case may not have spread as widely as it did, and the fate of Susan Lunn may have remained an enigma to those who knew and loved her for who knows how much longer. I want to end this video by mentioning this comment from a now-deleted Reddit user made before her identification. I saw a woman, and when I imagined this glaringly fake likeness brought to life, she's somewhat sweet. She isn't scary, she's just a poor lady with a medical condition who met a horrible end, and she deserves to be more than nightmare fuel for a world that has forgotten her. They're right. Susan did deserve more. But I think it's safe to say that now she'll never be forgotten. May she rest in peace.